Thank you. Lamont, can you go ahead and call roll for us?
Yes, ma'am. Mr. Treasurer Moore. Here. The Director of Finance, Mr. Tate. Ms. Heaton. Here. Ms. Dillon.
Here.
Mr. Keeling.
Here.
Mr. Rosenthal.
Here.
For the State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Ms. Zumont. Here. Mr. Unterman. Here. And for the State Controller, Mr. McGuire. Here. Madam Chair, you have quorum.
Excellent. For this one item in the open session, and then we'll go into closed session, we need approval of the 13-14 committee work plan and the investment committee charter.
As well as the agenda for today.
As well as the agenda for today. Thank you, Michelle.
So moved. Second.
All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? Excellent. All right, we're going to go ahead and move into closed session. So item 7 is our open session CIO report. Chris, you're on.
Need a break.
Take as if you do need to just go first. Yeah, right. He doesn't.
Hey, first off, I was excited because I wanted to take a chance to introduce some new people to you. Even though it is not her first day to start on vacation, she came here to see an investment committee meeting and witness it live. So our new Director of Global Equity will start in about, a week and a half. And I wanted to introduce you to her, and that's June Kim. So June, if you would stand up.
LaSara board, and I heard about it from LaSara before I heard from Chris. That people were saying, well, you're so lucky to have June. So you have a good, good rep from Los Angeles, which is my hometown as well. So LaSara board, sends their wishes to you. But I'm glad that we're able to have you come to CalSTRS. So welcome.
Yep. So as Sharon said, June is joining us from LA County. I think you probably all saw the announcement. She ran the global equity portfolio there, and we'll be thrilled to join the team here. And we will very quickly assimilate her to the San Francisco Giants and away from that other blue team that's down there. Yeah. No, we have a fun rivalry. The other person I want to introduce you to, a lot of you are new on the board, and last year the governor got rid of our students, so we didn't have one, but we had started the tradition a couple years ago of having a student.
He didn't do that. He's just kidding.
All right, sorry, the governor didn't.
Just made that up.
Yeah, whatever.
That's
The budget was axed for students, so whatever the thing was. We have each summer we hire a student intern to shadow me. Go to all the meetings, attend all the events, be in everything, and just learn about investments in the Chief Investment Officer office. And I wanted to introduce her because it's the only meeting she'll be at. So I want to welcome Adriana Gutierrez. Stand up. There we go. Adriana is a senior at Sac State, business finance econ major, and graduates this December. So, and made Dean's List and a straight A on her test last week. So, doing an awesome job. So in the portfolio, I want to run through first a correction on this slide because we just got corrected. Our assets look like at June 30, we're going to be 189.08, right? 08. So they're getting their pens out. So we're 189.00 at June 30, which is an all-time record high value for us. It's great to have that happen on the very last day of the business year. Hallelujah to that. And didn't crack 190, but got awfully close. So that looks like that will be our final year-end number is 189.00. 08. I'm sorry, 189.08. I see everybody writing in the back. I want to help them out. Every little bit helps. Well, whoop, there goes our all-time record high. And our applause, yeah. Here's the asset allocation. This is where we stood at June 30 with some slight adjustments, but as you can see, most importantly, we are within our policy ranges and actually very close to the target in almost every asset class. The board, the investment committee now discusses the asset allocation at every meeting in closed session, and we talk about our tactical shifts and things like that. Obviously, we're not going to report those in open session on TV because we don't want people to try and front run us in those. But the important point is the asset allocation is nicely distributed and very tight to the targets. Looking back at the year, this is the U.S. equity market over the fiscal year period. As Michelle had highlighted, we pointed out, it's not that it's a straight line up, but my goodness, what a powerful year that we had for the market, much stronger than people expected. Overall, the market, this is the Russell 3000, but the market was, or pardon me, the S&P 500, the market was up about 22% year to date. So very strong returns. And one of the things that's amazing is just the trend line. Even though we had some drops in the market, the overall angle of attack for the market was very positive and very strong. This is stepping back and looking at all the way back to March of 2009 when we hit the low. So this is the economic recovery that we saw in the market. Many on the board would remember in 2009 we talked about, is this going to be a V-shaped recovery, a U-shaped? We called it a square root. Some people have said it would be an L. That was, that it dropped and it would never come back. But it has basically been a V-shaped recovery, much stronger. And obviously you can tell by the slope of the line. The last 2 years have been extraordinary positive, with 2 20% years in the market in our fiscal year. So just amazing. This is stepping back and taking a longer view of the market. This is all the way back to 99. So now you're picking up the two recessions, the 01 to 02 recession, September 11, and it's putting the 08 global financial crisis in perspective. But just how remarkable the equity market in the U.S. has recovered from that and traded up higher. We had some resistance back in 13, and I remember us debating, would we break through the 07 highs? Is that possible? But it really shows how strong the market reacted at the end of 13 and into the beginning of 14. And if you think about that time period, remember, we had the federal government shutdown. We lost our AAA credit rating. I mean, just a really difficult time period, yet the market has recovered. Here is what the investment returns look like in dollar terms. So the U.S. market, generally including dividends, up about 25%. But non-U.S. up very strong as well. Some of the non-U.S. markets were up better than ours. Germany, even France. What's amazing, and I know I sent this in an email to the board, but for the public in the room, the best performing markets last year were also the scariest. If you had the guts to invest a year ago into Greece, Italy, Portugal, even though, here we were talking about Portugal extensively yesterday, Spain, you would have made 50% on your money in any of those markets last year in U.S. dollar terms. So just shocking, and very few people did. But you can see the lower return, but a positive return out of fixed income, and then obviously cash, no return. So I produced this slide yesterday, and we'll officially announce our results on Monday, probably around noon. But it looks like our fiscal year return will actually be 18.66. That's the awesome news, is we're up in the high 18s. I think we'll actually perform pretty well versus our peers. We will not beat our benchmark. We'll underperform our benchmark. That's 19.17. So we'll underperform it by about 51 basis points. Almost all of that performance difference is driven by the private equity benchmark difference. I don't have our 3-year number updated, but it's going to be a little bit higher than that 11%, so probably 11.1, maybe 11.2. And our 5-year number will also go up a smidge, maybe something like 13.7 or 13.8. I only know of Idaho so far, which was about 17.4. So I know at least some of our peers that were global will do better. In the past years, we beat them very soundly. I think our 18.6, I think we'll be nose and nose with PERS, probably fall a little bit short of theirs. But we're both going to be nose and nose up in the high 18s. So they'll announce their number on Monday as well. But overall, a stellar year. But here we are in July, and we're behind the 8 ball. Market's down a little bit from July 1st, so we've got a whole another year to make up money. But we'll be loading those that 3-year number especially into the portfolio, and that will help considerably. In that 3-year time period, we had the 18% this year, the 13% last year, but only 1.8% in the very first year of that 3-year period. So it kind of fits in with the discussion we had at the retirement board. It's great to have 2 positive years, but even then you could still have a flat year in that cycle. So if I go up the crow's nest and look at what's out on the horizon, the risks have not changed dramatically. Obviously, Israel, Palestine, Ukraine, Russia remain a big risk. The summertime always seems an interesting time for earthquakes. I know Mexico just had one just because of the temperature changes on the earth, so we'll have to watch that. I think the positives still stay in place. Don't fight the Fed. Historically low rates. You're now hearing people speculate that rates will go up April, March. I heard one as early as November. Everybody's trying to bet on it. I think the key is the market will react. It will react negatively. Historically, though, the first or second interest rate hike has not been that bad for equities and still may be a positive year. But whenever it happens, you'll see a lot of gyrations in the market when that comes. I think the most interesting takeaway right now is I heard on the radio that Janet Yellen used the word uncertainty over 6 times in her press conference. And so I think that describes it best. If the Fed chairman is seeing uncertainty, I think we're living in a world of current uncertainty. Change is the one constant we're all going to face. So that's it. Any questions?
Any questions from members of the committee? None. Thank you. Thanks, Chris. And I guess I want to speak on behalf of the investment committee that well done, staff. That's a great number. We recognize it's big part of a bigger picture, but I just want to thank the staff for their hard work this year. It's good for us. Thank you. Great. All right. So we are at item 8, approval of the minutes from June 6th.
So moved. Second.
All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions? All right, our minutes are approved. The annual review of delegation to staff. That's a consent information item. Chris? Are we just,
Just on the
it's
consent
just
agenda.
consent
If you wanna
agenda,
pull it,
right?
we can
Does
talk
anybody have
about
any
it.
questions or want to pull? Okay, Dana? Go ahead.
So Chris, this is the first time we're delegating authority to innovation and risk and infrastructure, or
Is-
the inflation-sensitive assets
You
of
did
infrastructure.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
We-
Go ahead, finish.
I'm good.
We delegated last.
You did during the year. This is just a once a year
Wrapping
at the
it
end of
all
the year
together.
report. Here's all the delegation, and I highlight the changes you made in the past year. So you did that by changing their policies during the year.
Okay.
This is not any change from what the policies stand. It's just
Just
reporting
putting it
out
all in one.
in a complete package.
Thank you.
I'll move approval.
I guess if it's a consent information item,
Oh, it's
Second.
info.
we don't need, do we need to vote on it? We
Oh,
don't
it's
need to, right?
information, no.
If it's info, so we're good. Okay, thank you, Chris. All right, so item 10 is the investment business plans. This is an action item, so.
So the way we run that, in the old days, every director would come up and present their business plan and talk through it, and the board told us, let's not do that again. You guys love hearing from the directors, but it takes too long. So what I'm going to do is just hit a couple of highlights on the big picture of the 10-year financial plan, and then the directors are here. If you have questions about any of their business plans, they are more than happy to come forward. So first off, the 10-year business plan, I want to report that INV 54 and 55 have been revised. The revised version is on the web out there for the public. The old version is gone. So those of us that have printed books can see the old version. And what it was revised for was the actuaries got us the new cash flow figures. And as I said to the retirement board, we still have a negative cash flow, but instead of constantly increasing, it decreases. And so what happened is the entire chart shifted up, and the projected line shifted up dramatically. I had to expand the chart to over 350 million for the first time ever. So, and the real numbers that jump off the page are the numbers out there in fiscal year 23, 24, where before we thought maybe we'd be 220 billion. We're now saying we could be right up against the size of PERS today. We could be right at $300 billion. And for those that don't know, PERS crossed 300 billion at June 30. So they'll get all the headlines this year, which is fine. But that's a dramatic change. So $75 billion shift in our 10-year financial plan. That has a big impact, obviously, on what we think the stresses on the resources are going to be. As I say in the plan, there are two drivers to investment resources: assets under management, which is AUM, and then the complexity of the portfolio. When I look at the handful of global peers that are $300 billion in size, and there aren't many that share their data, they are incredibly complex. They have gotten themselves out into, you think of any asset class and they are way out in the fingers. So in equity, they're just not US, non-US, and emerging, they're into the frontier markets. In real estate, they're out there into timber and vineyards and farther down. In hedge funds, they're way out there. So it becomes, I've heard broccoli, cauliflower, oak tree, whatever you want to think. Instead of a simple, basic structure to an asset allocation, the bigger peers tend to just proliferate. I'm not assuming that we'll do that. I'm assuming we'll stay fairly staid and steady, but that is something we have to keep our eyes on. The bigger peers are the sovereign wealth funds, which won't share their data.
For that, and that was a section I highlighted because I guess I just want to understand more about why, when they become larger, that it inherently has to become more complex, or it seems like that's the trajectory. I mean, why is that? Because it does seem like the more complexity, it adds to the cost, and so I guess I just need more help understanding why does it have to be that way. Can't you get bigger and stay less?
I don't have a soundbite answer. There's only a handful of them. Part of it is they have to deploy assets, and they don't want to keep deploying assets like in public markets. They want more alternative investments, and there's a limit of how much buyouts you want to invest in and how many real estate buildings you want to buy. And so they find themselves going into farther and farther areas. They're also constantly seeking diversification. So they think nobody's invested in wine or art, but that's probably out there at some point in these people's views, because it doesn't correlate with the public equity market as much. It is still correlated, but doesn't correlate as much.
Chris, is that true?
It might also be the size of the organizations. Yeah.
Would that be true, like for TIA-CREF, which is at, what, 400 or 500 billion? Would they be in that same?
To some extent. I think that's when you have to offer the services to the public, because they're trying to offer pretty straightforward there. But what they've done is built the internal management. The two halves of TIA-CREF, I think now are 380 billion on the two halves. And their staffing numbers are closer to 500 on the investment officer ranks. So, it would be double what we would expect for us in that. The peers I'm looking at are the ones that are more the defined benefit or sovereign wealth portfolios. But so we get to the business plan. Now this is just, you're not approving this, it's just an approximation. So I know Arena would be concerned about approving a budget 10 years out. The things I want to highlight, there's two things I want to highlight in here. First off, absolutely, I want to highlight the investment manager fees. Not that it's good or bad, but that's a number that gets published. And I get the feeling at PERS that's going to become a bigger focus. And this is only our contract. So it doesn't include carry interest, Tom. It doesn't include the partnership fees, because those get returned to us if it's a positive returning fund. These are just absolute hard fees I know we'll pay, or at least I estimate we will pay out. And I think the key takeaway is that we'll cross 200 million, that we'll be spending as much as 200 million on Wall Street firms a year, probably within a year or two. That number isn't necessarily bad. It's not necessarily good. It's just a big number. And I know at some point that will get people's attentions. Now, the counter to that, if we don't want to pay that, is we run assets internally. And we've been through that struggle because that's also the state budget, adding staff, compensation issues, space issues, any number of things at the staff level. So there's no simple solution. We tell you as a general rule of thumb that internal assets are about 1/10 the cost of external. The other takeaway on this chart, whoops, there we go, is the investment management fees, the gray box on the right side. You can see that our investment costs have been rising over time. Almost all of that has been driven by the new areas we invest in. So it's not just poor Stephen, I want to pick on him, but corporate governance managers have proven very costly. Any RFP we issue nowadays, the fees come back higher than they were before. So normally in an industry, increased competition, increased capital means lower prices. Not in the investment management business. We are seeing people still demanding, Wall Street's very creative in coming up with new structures that are all 2 and 20 and all very expensive. So that is part of the complexity, Sharon, that we'll have to decide on is, do we want to keep that? I assume in this model that we will see some fee breaks at size. We know we have fee breaks negotiated in our contracts, particularly in fixed income and global equity. As those accounts get bigger, we pay lower fees. And we're assuming that in that 10-year plan. But I'm troubled by the fact that in the prior 10 years, our life experience has been that there's an upward slope to that line. So cost is the one drag on the investment portfolio. That's why we monitor it very, very closely. You can see that over time, we're at about 14 basis points. I want to caution you, that's only the simple costs we can track. That is not the partnership fees. It is not what we label the CEM cost. That's a more holistic measure and probably a bit more accurate. If you included partnership fees and all those types of costs in this, that would be about double. It would probably be about 22 to 28 basis points that we would say is the drag in the portfolio.
Thing in November, do we get all of that
Yes.
that information?
That's why I want to contrast
So
it.
we
I
can
don't want
see
the
that.
don't keep 14 in your mind. Think of 14 as what we pay in cash. The 22 is kind of the total wealth cost to us if we don't get the returns we expect. The other number I think that we have to constantly think about is that as we look into the future and building the portfolio, there is a number in terms of staff resources, but there are also what we're seeing are rising costs of risk systems, the computer systems. I've built into this even inflation in some of the areas like transportation and some of the activities, but any of those could jump up higher than what we've anticipated. I think that's about I wanted to highlight for you.
Can I just throw this into that November conversation when we do the CEM and the staffing report? It would, I know for me, it would be helpful to even have maybe a case study or hear a little bit more about how we counter, because as you said that, just Wall Street changing the game or kind of being more sophisticated and figuring out other ways. I'd like to kind of know how our staff, I hear our staff talking about negotiating lower fees and trying to get around that, but I'd love to hear maybe an example or two of how we're combating that. Because again, I know I'm a broken record on this, but we're CalSTRS, we have a lot of money. Can we leverage our size to continue? I know our staff does this already, but to have a little bit more visibility from the board level of how we're doing that, how we're trying to mitigate those costs, because that is the one area we have some control over, right, in terms of controlling costs, is the amount of fees that we pay. And if we can maybe hear some examples of how we're doing that and continuing to fight against that.
CEM will, and last time she came in November, very nice lady from Toronto, very heavy Canadian accent, if that helps you remember her at all. But it was very late in the afternoon. It was kind of rushed. She had, I think, about 15 slides, and she only showed us 5. She will break out per asset class the cost we pay, what they think a fund our size should pay, and what our peers pay. The good news is in almost every single asset class, we pay less than what they expect, and we pay less than our peers. That's the staff's hard negotiating standards. So that kudos go to everybody on staff for doing that. What's also, though, in those figures, and that's the thing we have to think about, again, is that those new ideas, any new strategy we look at, and that's where the world has shifted on us. When I go back and I look at, say, even the mid-'90s, we always say we're the largest teacher-educated fund. We were one of the top 5 largest funds in the world. I looked at a list recently. We're not even the top 20. When you look at assets around the world, the sovereign wealth funds and even little countries are taking their oil reserves and creating a sovereign wealth fund, and because they're having inflows and we're essentially having outflows, they're catching up and passing us. And so now there's, a couple of Canadians that are much bigger than us, all the sovereign wealth funds that are bigger than us. And as countries, a good example would be Korea. They privatized their Social Security system. The Korea pension system is now twice our size. So it's not just that we're not in the top 20, it's that people are 2 to 3 to 4 times our size. And I can't imagine if you're at an $8 billion or even a $40 billion plan, but even at 100 and just short of 190, we try to negotiate, but particularly in those new areas. I guess I'm cognizant we had the discussion in closed session, but we were talking about real estate, and that's an area where we're competing against foreign capital, and a manager is much more interested in some of the other money than us, and we've lost that clout to push hard at our size. So it is something to keep monitoring and keep a very strong eye on.
Tom.
I touched on this last meeting, but the question of cost is there an implicit cost to the driven in our global equity world because of the now prevalence of high-speed trading and things like that? Are we finding our brokerage costs being driven, and or our execution isn't as good?
A lot of our execution is market at close. So when the close is your measure and you're getting it, it's tough to say that it is hurting us. We still don't believe that it's costing us in our execution. Our managers have not complained. If anything, they think it could be, and I got to say it right, when you think about a penny is 2 digits in, they're thinking it may be adding costs at the 4th digit. And part of the problem is we're used to paying 6 cents a share in commissions, so something out at the 4th decimal place seems pretty inexpensive. But we're applauding and been trying to encourage the SEC. As we said, it's a technology problem and it needs a technology solution, whether it's officially defining the trading as a second and a half second. And it's amazing to hear people cry about that, oh my gosh, you're going to slow us down to half-second intervals. But trading is more efficient when it's bunched. So we're applauding that, but we don't think on a dollar-wise we can measure how much it's affecting us. Makes for a good book.
Well, the ending sort of fizzled.
I'm hearing very good book. I haven't read that one yet. Very good.
I'll just tell you, the ending sort of fizzles.
Oh. Well, Hollywood will make a movie out of it. Do you have any questions about the long-term business plan or any of the investment business plans?
Anyone? I do not have anyone in queue. I did want to comment that I absolutely love the structure of this report. I thought for a board member, I think you've been listening to our feedback and really restructuring. I think the graphics and just short and sweet, but giving us the facts that we need to kind of like the internal and external, the staff count, so I really appreciate, I haven't figured out the scan thing. I haven't done that yet. The QR code. I don't,
You just need a QR
I'm not
reader.
there
You got
yet,
it.
but I think it's cool.
I would let you know too, and PERS is doing this, I applaud. I handed out, like your ESG report, 20, 30 pages thick. Well, you don't want to be killing all those trees, kind of counter ESG, to be running around passing those out and shipping them and all that. So you'll find from us as more and more reports go on the web, we'll actually produce little postcards just with a QR code so that if people want the report, they can go get it. And one of my goals is to actually arm you with those so that if you go to an event and people say, hey, I want to see your clean tech report or your California report, you just have a business card to say, scan this, and you're going to be able to find it. So we're going to push more and more to the web. We're also going to start using videos of our reports on the web so that when somebody wants to see the clean tech or the green team report, you hit a video and see Brian explaining what's in the report, because we find people will watch a 2-minute YouTube, then they will read through a 20-page CalSTRS report. So we'll start taking the things we've learned and putting that out into the public and for the teacher members.
All letters to the legislature now use QR codes. When we send them, all those letters we send with transmitting a report and this report and that report, we always glue down a QR code so they can get it quickly.
I'll download the app, I guess. I'm a little behind the times,
I
but
can't believe you haven't yet.
I know. I just, there's a lot of other things to do. Any other comments on the business plan on item 10? This is an action item. So I'd entertain a motion to,
Second.
all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay. Abstentions? All right, your business plan is approved. All right, so now we're at the private equity benchmark review, item 11. Mr. Moy from PCA and Chris. This is a conversation that we've had several times in closed session, and so we would like to continue the conversation. And let me go to where. So Margot, are you gonna tee it up for us?
Sure. We're here to discuss the private equity benchmarks. I use the word plural because we actually have 2 benchmarks. And after discussing the benchmarks, we'll discuss a proposed change to the policy. I'm going to turn it over to Mike, who's done the bulk of the research on this.
I'm going to assume that you've read this material, which takes you through the history of the benchmark. It's been rather, I would say, convoluted as the private equity industry became more exposed to different benchmarks. And it started out with, I would say, a high degree of uncertainty, and it's been moving more and more towards benchmarks that are more meaningful to the investors and the overseers. When you look at what's going on in the industry currently, among the top 20 big pension funds in the US and Canada, 14 of them have your benchmark, where it's either Standard & Poor's or Russell 3000 or whatever, plus a premium. 4 use a private benchmark, State Street, Cambridge, and then 2 that we couldn't find. So we've looked at your benchmark, and I think if you look at the charts that are in the material that staff generated for item 12, and you look at the chart that's in our letter, you've got 3 separate portrayals. One is a 3-year return, one is a 10-year return, and in our letter, there's a 1-year return. And the challenge has been, and will continue to be, what the time period is you should be using when you're looking at the performance. We have been saying to you at every semi-annual report that you should be looking more long-term than short-term. We've used 5 years, we've used 3 years during those conversations. Well, if you look at the chart, the one-year return on INV 87, which is our report with, it sort of depicts what's happened across the CalSTRS private equity, the State Street, and the Russell 3000. You can see the, let's call it, the volatility that's existed in the returns for the blue line, which is the Russell 3000 plus 300 basis points. It has gone from 20% in 2007, went down to minus 20 in 2008. 2010, it was like 14%. 2011, it was down at 7, maybe 6. 2012 was up at 32. Now, the interesting component of that is if you look at the other trend lines that are on here, you've got the CalSTRS private equity and as well as the State Street private equity. Those two lines have been, I would argue, they almost correlate. That's not the point of it, but it shows you that your peers are having the same experience you are. And you can also see the lag issue that is a big part of private equity. Because if you look at the trend lines as it relates to what's going on in the public markets, the ascent line between 2008 and 2010 for the Russell 3000 is faster during a certain portion of the time, and then all of a sudden the private markets catches up and exceeds it. And then the trend line going down is faster in the public markets than it is in the private markets. And then from 2011 to 2013, there's been almost no correlation because of the acceleration of performance in the public markets. So you as overseers and we as reporting to you have a real issue, I think. The issue you have to answer to is, should we be in the asset class? And if we should be in the asset class, how do we measure performance? I would say to you, in the long term, the way you should be looking at this is, can you beat your benchmark? Can you make more than the public markets plus 300 basis points? That's the choice you would be making. So we are saying to you, in terms of looking at this, you should be using 10 years to look at that benchmark. The reality is when you sit down on a every 6-month basis, annually, and you work in the intervening periods of time before you get to 10 years, what you really want to know is how you're doing versus your peers. Because if you're not doing well compared to your peers, then there's something that you should be worried about from a managerial perspective. But because the returns have a 10-year to longer horizon, we are arguing that you should be using a return that has a 10-year horizon, which is the one you are currently using. But we think for the shorter time period, you should be comparing yourselves to the State Street Private Equity Index.
Kind of looking, is kind of peer-based, it's looking at it.
State Street is your custodian.
Right, I'm sorry, the State Street Index, I'm
Right.
sorry, the SS.
I just wanted, State Street is your custodian, and they maintain an index.
Right.
And the index is for the private equity funds that are in the portfolios of their clients.
Right.
And they maintain that index and have been maintaining it for quite some time. In 2007-8, when we made the recommendation that you go to the Russell 3000 plus 300, we looked at the idea of potentially using the State Street Index. That was relatively early on in their entry into the index business. They've become more sophisticated and they've captured more information. And what's happened is you've got several providers who have index capabilities that you could be using. One of them is Cambridge. They have an index. It's our belief that their index is going to mirror the portfolios that their client base has. Their client base is very tilted towards colleges, universities, foundations. So the opportunity set for them is different than the opportunity set for the big public pension funds. The big public pension funds are deploying large amounts of money, typically to the bigger managers. So you run into some, I would argue, structural differences in the way the portfolios are constructed. And the State Street Index is going to be populated by those kinds of managers, because that's where most of the public pension funds, they use State Street as their custodian, as well as overseeing what's going on in their private equity portfolios. And that's what you should be using for comparative purposes.
So you're just saying the State Street Private Equity Index compares peers that are more like we are versus the Cambridge tool. Let me grab Tom, actually. Tom?
Okay, so generally, I agree with the recommendation, given the choices of comparisons, but as I was listening to you talk, it struck me that we really have basically, over a 10-year period, something of a, or longer periods, an absolute return objective for this asset class. We have a return objective of 7.5%. We are expecting a premium of maybe 1.5% over that from private equity. So that if you're not over that period of time measuring yourself against that absolute return, even if you're outperforming peers, we're not doing the job we want to do for the fund. So I'm asking you why an absolute return objective over the long term is not appropriate. I agree with you over the short term. And there's obviously the logical trap that if you don't make it in the first year, then you've got a lot more in your second through 10th to make the 10-year hurdle. But
I'm going to point you to INV 84, where the 10-year trend lines are for the three different benchmarks,
Yeah.
okay? And you can see that the delta between the public market and the private equity portfolio at the outset in 2007 was like 800 basis points, roughly. The delta, when you get out to 2013, 14, they're merging. The issue is,
those are 1-year periods, right?
no, this is the 10-year,
Rolling 10?
10-year numbers.
Yeah, okay.
Okay? The issue in my mind, you're absolutely right about having an absolute number, because, and I've had discussions internally about we should be using the numbers that are embedded in your asset allocations. That's what we should be measured against. I've been looked upon strangely, since nobody else is doing that. But that, to me, is the real measurement that you should be trying to achieve on an annual basis. However, most of the funds, like I said, are using this public benchmark. We had a conversation with State Street this morning about, okay, we want to have a short-term and a long-term benchmark. Well, they have never encountered that before. This is a relatively new, this is not relative, this is a new concept in terms of how you should be looking at your private equity funds in terms of their performance.
So I guess following up, there could be logic to my question of saying it's the hurdle is the benchmark, but not less than 9% or whatever the right number is.
And that certainly could be reported out as, let's call it secondary information. Because we've been reporting the State Street numbers as sort of secondary information in the semi-annual report. But we could also be reporting out what is the expectation for the asset class in the time periods from the asset allocation.
Okay, I'm not going to suggest that at this time. I mean, I think we're making a lot of progress with the recommendation you've made. So, but it just is embedded in the theory of all that we're doing here.
So.
So I have two questions. So the first question is I'm not, you explained a little bit about what the State Street Index is, but it sounds to me like it's essentially self-reported. So the the private equity managers are themselves reporting their own returns.
It's the investors reporting that they are capturing. So when the information comes from the manager to the investor, it goes to State Street also, and that's what you see in your financial statements.
But what I'm saying is it's reported by the managers to the funds, and State Street intercepts that and creates an index, but it's based on information that comes from the managers themselves.
Right.
So they're self-reporting the returns that they are generating for their investors.
That's true of every
I understand that. So well, no, that's not true of every index, because.
Every private equity index is
Okay,
self-reported.
but I'm just saying it's not true of every index. It's certainly not true of the S&P 500, which is based on publicly
Every
traded.
private market.
I understand that, but I'm still, that's not true of the Russell 3000 plus 300 or the S&P 500 plus 300. So I'm just contrasting it. I'm trying to understand the nature of this index, because there's not a market metric. It's a self-reported returns. And so it seems to me it's a little circular to I wonder how kind of objective it is to have an index that is self-reported. And I understand that we're always doing valuations, but in the long run, what we're doing is we're really measuring what our realized returns on private equity. In the long run, that's what we're really concerned about, and that's why we're investing in private equity. So to have an index that is based on largely unrealized self-reported returns, I wonder whether that's creating the right incentives.
The index measures realized and unrealized to the same extent that you capture it in your performance numbers in your financial statements. So it's
I understand that, but that's not, that doesn't, let me try a different way. So we're investing in private equity because we think we can do better than we can in public equity. We limit our exposure to it so that we, constrain our asset allocation. We recognize that one of the reasons that we should be able to get or expect to get a higher return is because we have less liquidity. So there's a trade-off there. But let me ask you this. If the reason we're investing is because over the long run, we do expect we're going to be able to get 300 basis points over the public equity index, do we have any evidence that the short-term index that you're proposing and the long-term index that you're also proposing for asset allocation purposes over the long run will be the same? In other words, yeah.
Look at the 10-year chart.
That's not addressing my question.
I thought your question was, is there any evidence that it's going to be roughly the same? And
If I can jump in, I might mess this up. Paul, what you're asking is our realized return versus the public markets. The 10-year number is picking up, you're right, some interim, the 06 funds, which are still an estimated value, but it does pick up our actual realizations. the life of private equity fund is a full 14 years. So since we only started in '89, a lot of these are really just finally coming to fruition in many cases. But the important thing is that each year you're picking up the actual cash flow, what they paid us if they sold a company. So you're getting the realizations there. And their interim valuation of a company has got to be validated by their advisory board, and then most of them are evaluated by their auditors, because they have to produce audited financial statements. So, but I understand your question, at least what I'm hearing is our actual cash back experience match what we expect to get 300 over the public markets? And when we line up the vintage years that have matured fully, the answer is yes, actually more so.
My biggest concern is that the incentive that we're going to create for staff is going to be to hit the short-term benchmark. And yet the reason that we're investing in private equity is because of what we're trying to accomplish in the long term. And what I want to make sure is that if we adopt a short-term benchmark that becomes what incentivizes staff, that's going to drive us to the long-term outcome that we're basing our asset allocation model on, and I don't see that.
I guess this is an incentive compensation question as opposed to.
It's not an incentive compensation. It's the whole, I mean, the staff, I mean, not just staff, I mean, we're reporting, right, annual results relative to our benchmark. So, I mean, the short-term benchmark serves a lot of different purposes, but everybody in the organization has an incentive to hit or exceed the short-term benchmark. But it's not to hit or exceed a benchmark that we're investing in private equity. We're investing in private equity because of a long-term goal. And what I'm saying is, it seems to me that it's very important that we adopt a benchmark, a short-term benchmark, that is going to, if we meet that benchmark or exceed that benchmark, that over the long run, we're also going to meet or exceed the long-term benchmark. And I don't see the evidence here to that.
The real answer to your question is the time period in whatever benchmark you pick that you're using for motivating staff. Because there's a limitation on availability of indices and availability of comparability. And your point is a valid one in terms of you don't want to have a short-term motivation when you have a long-term goal. And that to me is an issue.
Ones that are inconsistent.
Correct.
Right.
And
You're suggesting we have to have a short-term and a long-term that are different.
I'm saying anything under 10 years, I'm looking as short-term. And I would argue that if you pick a time period in there that's closer to 10 than it is to 1, you're going to have something that allows you to feel more comfortable about the motivations to staff.
Right, but I don't, maybe you're not hearing my question. What's coming to us is a proposal to have a short term and a long term, and the short term being, it looks to me like it's a 1-year benchmark. It's the State Street benchmark, which doesn't. I mean, well, you tell me this because I didn't see it. What does the State Street benchmark? What is its measurement period? Does it measure?
It's the same as it is for the total fund.
Okay,
So 1, 3, 5, and 10 years.
But I mean, you can. How often is it reported? The S&P 500 is reported every day. How often is the State Street reported?
State Street's reported every month.
Okay, so it's a 1-month benchmark. Basically, every month we can measure
That's correct.
our performance relative to the benchmark, right? So what you're asking us to do is adopt a 1-month, effectively a 1-month benchmark. And what I'm saying is I want to know that if we're managing to a 1-month benchmark over the long run, that the incentives are such that we're also going to achieve over the long run our long run benchmark, which is a 10-year benchmark.
What's up?
Let me just answer his question, and then Alan, you chime in. You asked me how often do they report it? They report it out monthly because that's how they capture the data, and they update it on a monthly basis. How it's used within your organization is a very different question, because effectively that's the only way they can capture the information is on a monthly basis. And they report it out then on quarterly,
But you know that
semi-annually.
we use it, I mean, we use it on an annual basis. I mean, Chris just reported the results for the last year relative to the benchmark. So, you know, we're looking for a short-term benchmark, not to use over the long run, but to use over the short run. So by necessity, what we've got is we're looking for a short-term benchmark because we need a short-term benchmark. We need a short-term benchmark for reporting relative performance, for incentive compensation. We need a short-term benchmark. What we've been told is that the one we've been using doesn't work very well, but works as a long-term benchmark. And all I'm saying is, I want to make sure if we're managing to a short-term benchmark, that the results are also that we're ending up managing to the long-term benchmarks. That's
So, Alan,
simple.
jump in, Alan.
I was gonna say, I bet Alan and I are thinking the same thing,
Okay.
so.
Well, one never knows.
I'm gonna freak out if we are.
So at the end of the day, the staff is underwriting for an instrument that's going to have a life of 10 to 14 years. They're not underwriting monthly, quarterly, or annual returns. And so, in fact, in my opinion, there's no way they can pick funds based upon short-term investment performance having any relationship to the public markets. They're making long-term investment decisions. So I truly don't believe that there'll be any difference in their behavior by having a short-term benchmark other than having a peer comparison, which is what this is how I would view it, to see how they're doing versus their peers over short periods. Their underwriting won't change at all because they have no control over what happens in the public markets. None.
We're not thinking the same thing. Different opinions.
Well, go for it. So, Chris, do you want to chime in?
I think part of it is our job is to invest in private equity. If we don't think it's a good investment, we won't. So we're not just investing in it because that's all we can do. But part of your question is it outperforming what we expect? Part of that falls to all of us in the asset allocation. If private equity isn't consistently delivering, say, 300 over the public markets, we as a board and staff would make the collective decision in the asset allocation model, let's lower the allocation to that. It's not delivering what we expect. It gets complex, and I wish we could measure the staff and me over 10-year and over 30-year time periods, but we know we can't. The staff, like Margot and Mike, I want them investing in their area. We have active discussions about whether we should invest more or less because we think the next 4 to 5 years is an opportunity or not. So she's not just investing in private equity because that's the box and invest no matter what. We try to pay attention to, is it rich, like you heard earlier? Is the real estate rich in the market or cheap? So they're making somewhat of a tactical decision, but Margot can't say, you know what, I don't want to invest in equity. I want to put the money that's allocated to me, I want to put it in the public markets. We've compartmentalized it where we're not allowing her to make that alone. We're making that as a group discussion. But the bigger issue of should we put that 13% somewhere else is yours as part of the asset allocation, which we visit every 3 years. So I know it's complex, but I think we've bifurcated that decision process, Paul, a little bit between what decisions staff should make, and then the bigger allocation issues are with the board, the investment committee. And you have 2 different measuring periods, but one has to be kind of the permanent ruler, and then we try and measure, okay, well, how are we doing year to year? We're trying to use a stick that actually is the investable universe, but keeping an eye on that big goal all the time of outperforming by 300. Otherwise, we won't be in private equity.
Because illiquid assets don't have good pricing. It's appraisal-based pricing, which is subjective and subject to change. Unequivocally right. You've got a whole bunch of assets that are managed that way, not just private equity, but real estate. you have no choice. But if you want to look at what the opportunity is in the short term to say, here's what's available. The beauty of, in my mind, of having the long-term benchmark is saying the only reason you're in the asset class is you expect a significant premium over the public markets. And that is, to me, what's driving the staff's investment decisions. And I think that's why the whole agency issue of what the short-term benchmark is really not that significant.
And so there's no way,
To game it.
that's was my exact
There is
question.
no way to game it.
Okay,
I'd say
words right out of my mouth.
it's impossible to game, just because of the duration question.
Our responsibility, though, as a board, really to oversee on the long run to make sure that this is a strategy that is meeting those long-term objectives.
The 10-year, reason that we're leaving that 10-year number the way it should be. That's what you should be looking at.
Are you good? For now?
I've got my questions
You've got your
answered.
answers. Tom.
Carefully worded.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, the only point I was going to make is, as Paul was asking his questions, and we don't have to go into it, is the one thing that is probably artificial is, in fact, what happens to these assets as public markets are accelerating or decelerating is that they gain and lose value at a more rapid rate. The markups and markdowns do not follow that. And so we're inherently looking at a somewhat inaccurate benchmark. But I do favor going to the one-year measurement to report our portfolio and to use the State Street Index. You could argue that Cambridge actually is a little bit more judgmental about reports that are given to them than the State Street, which just compiles. But I don't think the difference is worth it, and the comparability is to funds like us is greater. So I'm very comfortable with where we are.
Comfort letter. Joy.
Yeah, so the questions and the discussion just now was helpful. I'm just wondering, are there other funds or other entities that have this kind of policy in place with sort of a short-term versus a longer-term benchmark in private equity?
I'm not aware of any, but I believe there will be some once it's published what you all are doing. Because all of the large public pension fund investors have had the same problem. So there may be one. Here comes the voice from the back.
The only places where it's an issue is where there's incentive compensation tied to the benchmark because there was a huge disconnect because of the unbelievably rapid rising markets. In fact, if I was Margot and her team, I would not want this because if the public markets are flat, the private markets are a lagging indicator and they may well outperform for the next 3 to 5 years. But there are other people discussing this issue, but it's almost universally driven by performance compensation and the disconnect between the public and the private markets.
I was wrong. He didn't have one.
So my understanding, and I think in our conversations, we talked about this is listed as a review, and then our next item, which I think we should move on to, is looking at the policy revision, first reading. But the investment committee can take action today and recommend a change in the benchmark and refer this, I believe, to the comp committee for September, correct? Am I understanding all of that? Mm-hmm. So let's, well, I need some help here. So we can move on to item 12. But then would we vote on, I'm just trying to understand where we go from here. Do we vote on item 11
You'd
or?
only be voting on revising the investment committee policy.
Okay.
And what we're recommending is because it's always better to change benchmarks at year end or at calendar year end for measurement purposes. If you adopt it effective July 1st of 2014, that for the coming year, we'll use this as the measuring tool. Mike still publishes both numbers in his semi-annual reports. He has for almost, I guess, 5, 6 years. Pardon me? 7 years. So both numbers will still come to you in the semi-annual private equity report. We'd use it next year in terms of measuring how did we beat the portfolio benchmark. The investment committee action is what triggers the compensation committee to look at it. You don't have to tell them or anything. They understand that when the benchmarks change, they have to look at how should they change their attachments in their policies.
Let's move on to item 12. The private equity policy revision.
So, as I said in the introduction to the last item, we have benchmarks plural. Since 1999, we have used a public market index, and since 2007, since 1999, it's been the Russell 3 with various spreads. Since 2007, it's been the Russell 3000 plus 3, and that's stated in the policy as the performance benchmark is the Russell 3 plus 3. In 2005, we added an additional benchmark, and it says an additional performance benchmark shall be one of these industry data benchmarks. And since 2007, that has been the State Street Private Edge Index. So we've had the same index since 2007. One is just referred to simply as the performance benchmark, and one is referred to as an additional performance benchmark. As we see here, there's pros and cons to both, and it's not necessarily accurate to say this one's better and this one's a secondary. And so the proposed language is that the nuance be added that for 10 years and longer, the more important benchmark is the Russell 3, and for less than 10 years, we should focus on the State Street Private Edge Index.
From the committee, is it clear what the policy revision is? All right. So this is the first reading, but we can take action today. So I'd entertain a motion if. Tom?
I'd move we adopt the revised policy.
Second.
All right. Any discussion? All those in favor, say aye.
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 All those opposed? Abstentions? All right, the policy revision is approved.
Thank you.
So thank you. Thanks, Mike. Thanks, Marco. All right. Bye, Dan. All right. Item 13, our fiscal year 13-14 investment committee objectives. A recap, Michelle.
I just wanted to ask if you had any questions. I don't have anything to add to the item.
Oh, Michelle, I love
No.
you.
Just a slideshow.
She's really taken our comments to heart, hasn't she? Any questions or comments? Oh, are you all set, Dom? Okay. I don't think there are any questions or comments, Michelle. So thank you for that recap. Oh, I didn't see him in the. Okay.
a comment.
Go ahead.
The material was really good.
Tom did read yes, we read the material. Thank you. Thanks, Michelle. All right. And did we have any information requests, Lamont?
The only thing I have is,
Sure.
Can I request something?
Yeah. Sorry, Lamont. I think we have.
No,
a
I would
request.
just, there were a lot of presentations today with written presentation materials, and I would just like to, be able to get those, because I like to save them with the other materials from, there seem to be a lot of them today, and I appreciate them, they're very good, but I also like to sometimes take notes on them, and we didn't have that chance. I would also, if possible, appreciate copies ahead of time and in PDF, but if that's not possible, I do think it's useful to have them as a history of the meetings. Thank you.
So I know that, so I appreciate that. I know that this board has given you varying input on how long we want board materials, how short we want them, if we want hyperlinks or we want materials ahead of time. I anticipate maybe at the offsite, we could get a little, I know I talked even with Joy a little bit about, I think it would be helpful because for staff as you prepare and our consultants as you prepare to talk with us, what the board wants from you. And so I do think that, my sense is, and I think Harry can speak to this too, that, links or attachments, it seems like some board members they would like more information, and if it could be more in a link or attachments versus paper. But maybe in October we can discuss that a little bit more as a board to get a sense, to give more direction to you guys so that you're not just.
Also, we could, I'm just thinking, those are, and they are public documents. The PowerPoint we just saw today isn't just something we should email to you because really so I'm thinking maybe on the website, I think I'll ask Mary, who controls everything, about this, but I think we could create a part of that where you could store the presentations on the public website, part of it. That, like you'd have your own, because I don't want it to become a private document. Yeah.
Just, I mean, I think that's very common with
Yeah.
public agencies, that, all the
I think what we need to
presentation
figure out is
materials
some kind of
are available.
repository or some way so that if Paul wants to get that stuff, he can get it, but if Tom doesn't want to get that, he doesn't have it. So I think we need to work that out, but some way where different board members
Email
can.
with the links, but then I can make it part of a public inventory for the whole public to
I
have
think
these
that's
at their
great.
disposal too. That would work, I think. Yeah, let's
Excellent.
make it work for September then,
Thanks,
try to
Paul.
do that.
That's good.
Yeah, well,
So there you go, Lamont. There's your information request.
sure.
So let's take a look at the draft agenda for then our next investment. Do we have on there, Chris? Let's see, let me just make sure. We have the review of the responsible contractor, because I know it wasn't
Item 13.
item 13. Great.
September is always long because we have all the semi-annual reports.
Right.
So we may throw 16 through 19 early, we may throw it late, depending on your schedule in September, but I always say for the investment committee, I warn you, that in April are pretty beefy meetings, usually 4 hours at least, so.
Although, having said that.
Although.
I was sitting here going through the other
stand
work
corrected.
plans, and it isn't that lengthy the rest of the meeting. So on Tuesday, the staff will go through each committee and time it out, but it's possible you can do that in, I think, 2 days and not 3. That's the way I'm looking at it, even with Chris having, you said 4 right now. Yeah.
I'm gonna guess 4.
Yeah, I think actually it looks to me more like a 2-day meeting. We'll get back to you quite soon so you can get your calendars right. It does not look that lengthy to me, though, overall.
And we have appeals, a couple appeals.
We have, it sounds like we have 2 appeals cases for September.
But we'll run that again if you seem to be comfortable concurrently with audits, which will be a good 2-hour meeting. I can see that, and that way you're still doing great.
Our last item is opportunities for statements of the public. I have one request from Thomas McIntyre from the International Union of Bricklayers and Allied Craft Workers. So go ahead and, Thomas, just go ahead and, we have microphones on either side, and you are able to speak for 5 minutes, and welcome.
Does it work? Can you hear me? Okay. Thanks. Good afternoon. My name is Tom McIntyre. I'm a bricklayer by trade. Really? People don't often tell me they can't hear me. All right. Okay. My name is Tom McIntyre. I'm a bricklayer by trade, and I'm here as a representative of the International Union of Bricklayers and Allied Craft Workers. As a result of our union's concerns over the failure of the CalSTRS owned development company, Elcor, to comply with the system's responsible contracting policy, specifically as it related to projects in Montclair, New Jersey, and the greater Washington, D.C., Northern Virginia area. On behalf of the International Union President James Boland, I would like to express our appreciation to Jack Enos, Chris Ailman, Mike DeRee, Mike Thompson, and of course Sharon Hendricks for hearing our concerns and agreeing to meet with a CalSTRS representative and President Boland in Washington, D.C. I believe we've already set a date. We look forward to offering whatever assistance we can to help achieve the shared goal of producing a positive rate of return on investment while maintaining high road construction strategy that protects workers. I appreciate all the time and effort I was able to have with the leadership of CalSTRS. We were treated fairly, to say the least, and between the participants of the system, the teachers that I spoke to, and the leaders and representatives, I want to say thank you. We appreciate it. So we look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you for the time.
And I do know, I think in keeping with, I think this year we're trying, as we have public comment, to be able to follow up in some public way in the next board meeting with an update, if we met or not, what was the result of that meeting. And so I would anticipate in September that we would have some kind of, just brief report on kind of the outcome of that meeting and where we're at with that. So thank you. With that, anything else? Anything for the good of the order? With that, we will adjourn Investment Committee and enjoy your weekend.
Thanks.
And safe travels, Dana.